Steve Greif, retired history teacher at North Bend High School. I volunteer down here with my wife 2 days a week. And I happened to have a show a couple years ago that I really slimmed down. So this used to be an hour long. I'll just give you 15 minutes just to kind of wet your whistle a little bit about the history of our area. I should note that another anniversary this year's Bay Area Hospital turned 50 in May. And then pretty soon with the Egyptians going to turn 100. So there's a lot of things going on, and our museum has been a part of almost all those celebrations. I don't know, if you're listening to the radio, you might hear my voice. I made 10 different history segments on the radio stations that will play over the next 10 weeks about the history of Coos Bay because we're celebrating 150 years. All the bi-coastal media stations, as well as I think The Legend, which is an independent one. So hopefully you'll hear some more about history of Coos Bay, and then I'll be doing a talk in August also about the history of Coos Bay. But today, let's talk a little bit the importance of music in our area, as our music band instructor from North Bend High School just entered the room, which is awesome. Won the state championship last year, Amber Yester. So I will place this caveat that I do not play music. I sing poorly and can't read music at all, but I'm a historian, so I relied on others about to show you, is that almost all the bands here were brass bands. And that has a lot to do with the wars that America started with in the early part of our history. John Hartman, who was a music teacher at North Bend High School, did a master's thesis about the history of bands in our South Coast. And so I'm relying on John's research, really. I can give him a lot of the credit. And he notes that the brass band movement was an outgrowth of the American military band movement that started in 1776. And then during the Civil War, there was also a demand for military performing groups. And out of those events, it became sort of common for almost every town to have some sort of brass band. John Philip Sousa is probably a name everybody recognizes. He was in the first Marine band, was one of the first bands ever in the United States in 1798. And at age 13, he became a leader of a brass band, and his music and his performances are something that just stirred the nation. And I think everybody wanted to have a band after this. You'll note everybody in this picture, which is not a museum picture, it's just one off the internet, is all these are brass instruments. So every town had a brass band, a military band, and Marshall was among them, celebrating 150 years this year. In 1876, that's probably when they had their first band, so they've been around for a long time. It was typical to play at the opening of new buildings in town, and every 4th of July it was a major important thing to have a July 4th parade, and they'd always play the John Philip Sousa marches. The picture on the left is of right outside our window here. This is on Front Street. Front Street used to be a wooden planked street, and it was the heart of downtown Marshfield. And we must have dozens and dozens of pictures of parades on Front Street. It was the place to be in the late 1800s. Besides having your town band, most fire departments had a band as well. Here's a picture of them on the left, marching down Front Street on that planked wooden street. They formed their band in the 1890s. And unfortunately, Front Street had a major fire in 1922 and destroyed the heart of downtown Marshfield. Along with it, it destroyed the fire department. In fact, the first building to fall was City Hall, which housed the only fire truck they had. The fire truck fell in the bay at the start of the 1922 fire. And so that was the end of the Marshfield band. Now I've come to realize that a lot of these bands, like fire department bands and coal mines, we have coal mine bands here too, I think they formed them not only for the social entertainment of it all, but I think the exercise of it all. I mean, these guys needed to be in shape. And in miners in particular that were under the ground all the time, I think they formed choruses and bands to just exercise their lungs more than anything else. Empire, which is now part of Coos Bay, had their own brass band. The leader was a man named Charles Getty, who I have the arrow pointed to him, organized in 1884. And then they were independent, and then they later merged with the Coos Bay Concert Band. We have these great pictures. Anytime you see a picture with the initial CHM underneath it, it just tells you it came from our collection. And I like to advertise that because we have over 250,000 photographs in our collection. It's just a huge resource here. So here's the band that the Empire Band merged into, the Coos Bay Concert Band. And these bands were bigger than your town bands and more modern. And this one had up to 34 players from all over around the county, not just Coos Bay. They played at the state fair, and they kind of represented your town. Whenever your town, another town had a parade, you'd send your band to that place. One of the interesting things that John wrote about is that these guys are wearing an American Federation of Musicians uniform. It was a standard uniform, so that if you moved to a different town, guess what? You had the right uniform for that town too. So some uniforms were specific to a city, but a lot of them were just a generic national band uniform that when you moved, you could play with them as well. Here's one that's not a traditional band that you can move around with. This is a pirate costume, of course, Marshfield Pirates. This is the American Legion Post Band, and they had great little costumes. So not everybody had the same costume. Not to be outdone with Marshfield's band, North Band had their band too. Louis Simpson, the town founder, had this band, and notice the S on the drum, that's the Simpson, the diamond logo, the diamond S logo is the Simpson brand, led by a man named Charles Kaiser, and it started in 1905. This picture would have been taken at where Ferry Road Park is now. And they played once again, at the opening of any kind of important building. This is the corner of Virginia and Sherman Avenue, right downtown North Bend. You're looking at the band in action there. The street is dirt in this photograph in 1906. And there is a lot in North Bend that's 1 block away from the main street that's called Lincoln Square. And it used to have a bandstand. And well, I don't have a whole lot of pictures in our collection of bandstands, but this is a good one. It's near an historic church in North Bend. Most of you have probably been by this place now, which is just a kind of little park. It once had a bandstand, and that was pretty typical of most towns. Here's the Myrtle Point Brass Band. And what's important about it is it started in 1880, so it was an early one. And 2 families involved in this band were really important families in the south part of Coos County. The Herman family and the Schroeder family. There still is a Schroeder Furniture in Myrtle Point, you probably heard of that. The Hermans, there's Herman Street, and all kinds of things named after their family as well. But once again, this is what their band looks like. Part of the fun of putting on these shows is just looking at the great photos, I think. Here's the Coquille City Trombone Band. Pretty good looking group there. They got a snare drum as well. And not to be outdone, this is the Coquille Ladies Band. John Hartman wrote that women's bands were frequent, if not commonplace, throughout the nation prior to the 1920s. This group formed in the 1890s. Several women were relatives of the men's Coquille Trombone Band. But they have their own brass instruments, and they last until at least 1915. They don't seem to have standard uniforms, but other than that, and we even know their names. However we got this photo, they were all named too, so that's pretty awesome. Coquille had another band, which I love. It's called the Coquille Hungry 10 Band. And there's 10 members there, and they're boys. So the band took its name from the typically hungry teens who sometimes stole milk from porches in town or purchased bakery donuts or day-old bread for a nickel. Teenage boys always hungry, so the Hungry 10. This was organized by a 15-year-old boy named Stu Norton, who went on to perform at local clubs here as an adult later on. And it may have been the first public school band in our county. So that's what our first school band probably looked like. We had no consistent instructors, said Mr. Norton, but a teacher or two who knew how to play would come in and keep an eye on us. So instruction was probably pretty shaky, and the arrow is pointing, the red arrow is pointing to Mr. Norton. Powers. Here's a poster of Powers, including above the main picture of the city is Mr. Powers himself, but the red arrow is pointing to the Powers Lager Band. And once again, it's a brass band with a few drums. And I was just talking to Wilbur ahead of this, and even Langlois had a band, right? Yeah, everybody had a band. Here's the Banded Cornet Band, formed in the 1890s, and they're playing on the right, of course, in the July 4th parade. I think that was a prerequisite of being in a band, to know how to march on July 14th. Yeah, that's the reaction this picture gets every time. God's Regular Army Children's Band in Bandon. It's one of the, I'd say this is one of the top 10 cool photos that we ever had. They're on the dirt street in downtown Bandon, and they're learning how to play music. Like I said, there are fire department bands, there are also mining company bands, but they have young students, men and women, boys and girls included in this band. I mentioned school bands before, the Coquille Hungry 10, for example. Here's a North Bend band. They call it the KHS Orchestra. North Bend for a year was known as Kinney High, until it was discovered that Mr. Kinney didn't own the land he donated to North Bend High School.